The stone walls of Pembroke Castle held a sound that did not belong to the living. January 1457. Winter pressed its weight against the fortress like a fist. Inside a narrow chamber, the air was thick, heavy, breathless. A girl screamed. Not the cry of a mother, not the pain of labor. Something deeper, something tearing. She was 13 years old. Her body was too small, her bones too soft, her hips too narrow. The women in the room knew it. They did not say it. They did not need to. The baby was too big. A midwife pressed both hands against the girl's abdomen. Another held her shoulders down. A third wiped sweat from her face that kept returning faster than cloth could absorb. The fire roared in the corner. They believed heat would help. They believed cold air carried poison. So they sealed the windows. They shut the door. They locked the oxygen out. The girl gasped. Her lungs fought for air that was not there. Her name was Margaret Beaufort. She did not understand politics. She did not understand claims to thrones. She only understood pain. Her body convulsed again. A sound came out of her throat that no child should ever make. The midwives exchanged glances. Silent, grim. They had seen death before. This looked familiar. Blood pooled beneath her. Dark, spreading, too fast. The linens soaked through. Another sheet was pushed under her. Then another. It did not matter. The blood kept coming. Outside the chamber, men waited. They did not hear a child dying. They heard opportunity. A boy meant power. A boy meant leverage. A boy meant survival. If she died, it would be unfortunate. If the child died, it would be unacceptable. Inside, the pressure increased. Her pelvis strained. Cartilage stretched beyond design. Then it cracked. Margaret screamed again. Her fingers clawed at the mattress. Her nails tore fabric. The midwife leaned closer. "Push," she whispered. Margaret shook her head. She could not. Her body had already crossed its limits. Another contraction hit. Violent, unforgiving. Her vision blurred. The room tilted. Sound faded. They slapped her cheeks. Stay awake. Because if she slept, she might not return. Hours passed. Or minutes. Time dissolved into agony. Finally, the midwife felt movement. Ahead. Too large. Too slow. They pulled. Not gently. Not carefully. They pulled like men dragging treasure from rubble. Margaret's body tore. Muscle split. Skin gave way. The scream stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a cry. A baby's cry. Thin, sharp, alive. The women exhaled. The men outside smiled. They had their boy. Margaret did not move. Her face pale. Her breathing shallow. She had survived. Barely. The child was lifted. Bloody. Fragile. Wrapped quickly. A son. He would later be known as Henry Tudor. But in that moment, he was only a living proof that the sacrifice had worked. The midwives cleaned the wreckage. They did not speak about what they saw. They did not mention that her body was destroyed, because that truth did not matter to the men outside. Margaret lay still, her eyes open, staring at nothing. Pain still burned inside her, but something else formed beneath it. Not grief, not relief, calculation. She had been used, broken, nearly killed, for a crown she had never seen. The child cried again. She turned her head slowly. Her son, her survival, her purpose. The room smelled of blood and smoke. The walls kept their silence. But something had changed. A 13-year-old girl had entered that chamber. A different mind left it. The body was shattered. The will was not. Outside, winter winds battered the castle. Inside, Margaret Beaufort made a quiet decision. If the world would treat her like a piece on a board, she would learn the rules, and one day, she would move them all. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The child survived. The girl survived. But survival did not bring safety. Morning light crawled across the towers of Pembroke Castle. Snow clung to the outer walls. Inside, Margaret Beaufort lay still, unable to move. Her body was broken, her future uncertain. But the real danger had already begun. The boy she had delivered carried more than blood. He carried a claim. Thin, fragile, but dangerous. The English crown did not belong securely to anyone. Power shifted constantly. Alliances cracked overnight. And in this chaos, a child with royal blood was not protected. He was hunted. Margaret understood none of this at first. She only saw men whispering, messengers riding in and out, guards doubling at the gates. The boy was important, too important. His father, Edmund Tudor, would never see him. He had already died months earlier, captured, imprisoned, destroyed by sickness in a cold cell. Margaret was now a widow. At 13, a widow with a newborn heir, and a fortune. That combination made her the most valuable target in England. She could not walk yet, but negotiations were already happening around her. Men discussed her future like property. They debated who would control her lands, who would control the child. She listened, quietly. Her body hurt with every breath, but her mind remained awake. Outside the castle, England was tearing itself apart. Two rival factions circled each other. The House of Lancaster, the House of York. Both wanted the throne. Both wanted leverage. Both wanted the boy. Because one day, that boy could change everything. Margaret held him close. He was small, fragile, warm. She realized something slowly. This child would never have a normal life. Neither would she. Every knock at the door sounded like danger. Every whisper felt like betrayal. Weeks passed. Her body healed, but not completely. She could stand. Barely. One evening, a rider arrived. Mud covered his boots. Urgency in his voice. He spoke with Jasper Tudor, her brother-in-law. The conversation was quiet, but the tension was loud. The Yorkists were moving. They wanted the child, not to protect him, to control him. Margaret felt fear tighten her chest. She had nearly died bringing him into the world. Now others wanted to take him. Jasper understood the stakes. He studied the maps, the coastlines, the patrol routes. Staying at Pembroke was no longer safe. The castle was strong, but betrayal did not need force. It only needed one open gate. The decision formed quickly. They had to leave. Not openly. Not with banners. Quietly. At night, Margaret listened as plans unfolded. Her hands trembled. Not from weakness. From realization. She was about to run. With a newborn. Through a country at war. The risk was enormous. But staying meant capture. She looked at her son, his eyes closed, breathing soft. She made her choice. The next evening, preparations began. No servants informed, no lights lit, only whispers. A horse was saddled, another prepared, cloaks packed, food minimal. Speed mattered more than comfort. Margaret wrapped the baby tightly, her arms still weak, but she refused help. This was her responsibility. The gates opened slowly. No trumpet, no signal, just darkness. They rode into the night. Cold wind cut through her cloak. The road uneven. Her body screamed with every movement. But she held the child firmly. She would not let him fall. Behind them, the castle faded into shadow. Ahead, Uncertainty waited. They rode for hours, through forests, across frozen fields, avoiding main roads. Every distant sound felt like pursuit. Every light in the distance looked like soldiers. Margaret did not speak. She conserved her strength. The pain from childbirth had not fully healed. Each jolt reopened it. Still, she rode, because capture meant everything ending. By dawn, the coast appeared. Gray water stretched into the horizon, waves crashing against rock. A ship waited, small, weathered. This was their escape, or their grave. Margaret stepped down slowly. Her legs nearly collapsed. Jasper steadied her. She refused to show weakness. They boarded quickly. The sail lifted. England faded behind them. The sea did not welcome them. Wind rose. Clouds gathered. The water darkened. A storm formed without warning. Waves slammed against the hull. The boat tilted violently. Margaret clutched her son. Rain soaked them. Cold bit into her bones. The sailors shouted, trying to hold course. But the storm decided otherwise. They were pushed off route. Farther, westward, hours passed in chaos. Finally, land appeared. Not England. Rocky coastline. Unknown. They had reached Brittany. The ship grounded roughly. They stepped onto wet sand. Margaret looked around, exhausted, shaking. A new land. No allies. No guarantees. But they were alive. Watching from above, guards moved. Messengers ran. The ruler of this territory would soon hear. A boy with a claim had arrived. And in a world built on power, that meant opportunity. Margaret tightened her grip on her child. She had escaped England, but the game had only begun. The coast of Brittany was cold and unforgiving. Gray waves slammed against jagged rocks. The sky hung low, heavy with storm clouds. Margaret Beaufort stepped onto the wet sand. Her legs trembled. Her arms ached from holding the child. Behind her, the small ship creaked in the tide. In front of her, strangers watched. Armed men stood along the ridge. Their cloaks whipped in the wind. Their hands rested on swords. They had already understood something important. This was no ordinary arrival. A woman, a newborn, a noble escort, fleeing England. This meant politics. This meant opportunity. Margaret pulled the child closer. Her cloak soaked, her body still healing, but her mind alert. She had escaped one danger. Now she stood inside another. Messengers ran inland. Horses carried news fast. Within hours, word reached the ruler of this territory, Francis II. He listened carefully. An English noblewoman, a child with royal blood, stranded on his shore. He understood immediately. This was leverage. If England wanted the boy, they would negotiate. If England feared the boy, they would pay. Either way, the child was valuable. Margaret and her small party were escorted inland. Not roughly, not gently, professionally. They were not prisoners, not guests either. The road wound through forests and villages. Locals watched silently as they passed. Whispers followed them. Margaret rode slowly, every movement still painful. But she refused to show weakness. She had learned something already. Power watched carefully. Weakness invited control. After hours of travel, the fortress appeared. Stone walls rising from the earth. Tall towers cutting into the sky. Chateau de El Homine. This would become their new world. The gates opened. They entered. Inside, the atmosphere was controlled. Orderly. Quiet. Servants approached. Rooms were prepared. Warm food brought. Everything looked welcoming. But Margaret noticed the guards. Always present. Always watching. Her son was examined by attendants. Healthy. strong, that made him even more valuable. Later, she was summoned. The Duke wanted to see her. She walked into the chamber slowly, her steps measured. Francis too sat at a long table, his expression calm, his eyes calculating. He looked at the child, then at Margaret. He spoke politely. He offered protection. He promised safety. But his words carried weight beneath them. The boy would remain here, under his care, for his protection. Margaret understood. This was not a request. She nodded. She had no army, no bargaining power, only patience. Days turned into weeks. Life inside the castle settled into routine. Tutors arrived. Servants cared for the boy. Food was plentiful, but the gates remained closed. Margaret could walk the courtyard, but not leave. Guards stood at every exit. Her son grew. Strong, curious. He would later be known as Henry Tudor. But here, he was simply a hostage with good manners. Margaret watched carefully. She learned the patterns. Shift changes, visitor schedules, messenger arrivals. She listened to rumors. England wanted the boy. England feared the boy. Negotiations had already begun. The Duke smiled often, but his decisions were strategic. The boy would not leave easily. One night, Margaret stood by a window, the sea visible in the distance. Dark, endless. That water separated her from home, from allies, from control. She realized something chilling. She had escaped England, only to become trapped in diplomacy. Her son's life depended on negotiations she could not influence directly. But she did not panic. She did not cry. Instead, she watched, learned, calculated, because she understood something now. Survival was not about strength. It was about patience. The Duke believed he controlled the situation. England believed time was on their side. Margaret believed neither. She held her son one evening as the sun faded, his breathing calm, his future uncertain. She whispered nothing, but her mind moved. If they treated her child like leverage, she would learn to turn leverage into power. The storm that had pushed them here was over, but a larger storm had begun. And Margaret Beaufort was no longer just surviving. She was preparing. Morning bells echoed across Chateau de El Homine. The fortress woke slowly. Servants moved through corridors. Guards rotated posts. Inside a chamber overlooking the inner courtyard, Margaret Beaufort watched her son sleep. He was safe, but not free. Days had turned into months, months into years. The arrangement became clear. The Duke of Brittany, Francis II, treated the boy well. Warm meals, educated tutors, comfortable rooms, but guards never left the door. This was not kindness. This was containment. Margaret understood the structure. The boy was insurance, a living bargaining chip. England wanted him, or feared him. Either way, his existence created value. Her son, Henry Tudor, grew quietly inside those walls. He learned Latin. He studied scripture. He practiced manners. He was being shaped into a nobleman, but also into a controlled asset. Margaret walked the corridors daily, always observed, always measured. She spoke carefully, listened more than she spoke. Messengers arrived from England frequently, their cloaks marked with travel dust, their conversations private. But rumors traveled. The English crown wanted custody. They promised alliances, trade, gold. The Duke listened to every offer. He never rushed. Margaret realized the truth. Her son's safety depended on competition. As long as England wanted him, he lived. If they stopped caring, he disappeared. That thought hardened her. She began to focus on details. Who carried messages? Which courtiers whispered? Which guards were loyal? Every pattern mattered. One afternoon, she watched Henry playing in the courtyard, wooden sword in hand, laughing, unaware of the political gravity surrounding him. She felt a brief ache. Then she buried it. Emotion weakened judgment. She needed clarity. One evening, she was summoned again. The Duke spoke calmly. Negotiations were increasing. England wanted the boy transferred. They claimed it was for protection. Margaret knew what that meant. Control. Possibly elimination. She bowed politely. But inside, alarm spread. If the Duke accepted, everything ended. She returned to her chamber, sat quietly. For the first time since the escape, she felt urgency. Waiting was no longer enough. She began speaking more carefully with trusted attendants. Small conversations, indirect questions. She gathered fragments. England was offering money, ships, military cooperation. The pressure on Brittany was rising. One night, rain struck the windows. Wind howled across the fortress. Margaret held her son again. He was older now, stronger, but still vulnerable. She looked at the door. Guards stood outside. She understood something clearly. Stone walls protected them and imprisoned them at the same time. Henry asked a simple question. When can we go home? She paused. Her answer was calm. Soon. But she did not know if that was true. Time passed. More negotiations. More whispers. Margaret sensed the balance shifting. The Duke could change his mind any day. She realized she could not rely on his decisions. She needed preparation, strategy, patience. She watched her son study by candlelight. His shadow stretched across the wall. A boy growing in confinement, a future uncertain. Margaret turned toward the window again. The sea still separated them from England, but she no longer saw it as distance. She saw it as a barrier. As long as they remained here, they lived. If they crossed back under enemy control, they risked everything. The realization settled heavily. Their survival depended on staying valuable, staying useful, staying untouchable. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, not in prayer, in focus. She had escaped once. She might need to escape again. But this time, the stakes were larger. A storm had pushed them to Brittany. Politics held them there. And somewhere beyond the horizon, England was watching, waiting. The years had sharpened Margaret Beaufort like steel in a forge. She had learned the rhythms of survival, the delicate choreography of threat and opportunity. Every action measured, every silence purposeful. Henry Tudor, her son, was growing. Strong, intelligent, cautious. A boy who carried the weight of a kingdom in his blood. A boy who would inherit not just titles and lands, but decades of strategy and vigilance. Margaret understood something her enemies did not. Power did not live in armies. Power lived in information, in influence, in money, in timing. Control was invisible. It was surgical. She continued to operate from her estate in England while maintaining a careful relationship with Brittany. Every shipment of gold, every coded letter, every messenger passing under the guise of routine trade carried her influence across the sea. Her network was subtle, yet formidable. England churned in chaos. Kings rose and fell. Dynasties fractured. Men fought and died for crowns that were never truly secure. Margaret watched. She catalogued weaknesses. She noted alliances, betrayals, vanishing loyalties. And when the moment arrived, she struck, not with armies, but with precision. She positioned Henry strategically. She arranged marriages and alliances. She navigated the treacherous currents of English politics with an almost surgical mind. Every detail mattered. Every small decision accumulated into a vast machine of influence that no man could see coming. Even the most powerful lords were unaware of the scale of her preparation. She had trained Henry not just to survive, but to thrive, to understand the subtle levers of power, to recognize threats before they appeared. Margaret's patience bore fruit when Edward IV's line weakened. The Yorkists had made errors. Fractures appeared. The realm was unstable. Henry Tudor was ready, not because he commanded armies, not because he had the crown, but because he had survived, because he had been instructed, guided, and protected by a mother who understood that kings are made first in strategy, not in battle. Margaret returned to the court, her presence subtle but undeniable. She moved like a shadow among the nobles, every word chosen, every gesture calculated. She met the men who had once hunted her family. She smiled, she bowed, she listened, and then she acted. Through careful arrangement, through patience and unseen pressure, Henry Tudor returned from Brittany. He was 13 now, not a child anymore, but still under the careful guidance of his mother. The stage was set. Henry's claim was legitimate. His alliances were secure. The Yorkist opposition was fractured. The culmination was quiet, precise, almost invisible. Henry ascended. The crown was placed on his head, not because of brute force, but because Margaret had constructed every piece of the puzzle. Every ally, every coin, every piece of intelligence had been orchestrated to bring this moment into existence. And when Henry Tudor became King Henry VII, the legacy of his survival and his triumph was hers alone. Margaret Beaufort had transformed trauma into strategy. She had turned blood, fear, and loss into a blueprint of power. She had survived brutal childbirth, the death of her husband, and the abduction of her child. She had navigated international politics and outmaneuvered kings. She had done it all with patience, cunning, and unshakable focus. Her enemies had underestimated her. History would remember her son as the king who restored order. But it was Margaret who had restored the possibility of order. The quiet corridors of her estates witnessed the final triumph of a woman who had once been a 13-year-old child, torn and bleeding, who refused to break. Margaret Beaufort had built an empire of influence. She had bent men, dynasties, and kingdoms to her will. And she had done it without ever drawing a sword. Every movement she made had been calculated. Every smile, every letter, every coin spent had been an act of war. And when Henry Tudor finally claimed the throne, it was not luck, not fate, not destiny. It was Margaret's invisible, relentless hand that guided him there. She had turned survival into conquest, trauma into strategy, fear into dominance. And in that quiet, relentless exercise of power, she became more than a mother. She became the architect of a dynasty, the unseen force shaping the fate of a kingdom, and a testament to the strength of intellect, patience, and resolve. The storm had passed. The sea had calmed. The boy was king. The mother had conquered history. Margaret Beaufort's legacy would endure not just in the crown of her son, but in every action she took to seize it. She had transformed blood and suffering into power, and nothing could ever take it from her. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.